Hi, returning now to Cubs and Culture for January 31st, 2018, continuing our discussion of Moonlight. Now, I think this issue of the movie lacking sort of emotional momentum is partially due to the screenplay because it is sort of broken up into these three segments. But I think it's largely on... So I think on the page it would work better. Or on the stage. This was a play at one point. It probably works better because of sort of the nature of stage shows. But in movies, because you're watching it as sort of a continuous story, it ends up feeling extremely episodic. And because Cyrone's played by three different actors, you feel like so there's a jump in time between Act 1 and Act 2, and then Act 2 and 3. That each time this happens, you feel like you're starting another movie. So it doesn't feel like first act, second act, third act. It feels like part 1, part 2, part 3. And I think it's mostly in the way in which Jenkins, who's the director, decided that he was going to do the act breaks or the jumps in time by cutting to... So what happens is there's a climax for the act, and then there's a little bit of a announcement, and then it cuts to black. Then it cuts... starts up a scene, usually a little bit of an introductory scene. Like in the second segment, Chiron is in class, and there's like a 4-minute scene about him being in class and being teased about being too girly. And then it cuts to black, and it has two eyes for two Chiron, and that also happens again with black, and it also sort of happens at the beginning with little. And so it doesn't... So, of course, this works sort of thematically because it's about the way in which this character's identity isn't, where he's not sure who he is, and how it is his identity is sort of fractured. And unstable, especially around gender and sexual orientation, which is fine. It sort of works thematically, but by doing the jumps where it cuts to black and then has a title on the screen, it ends up feeling much more like three distinct episodes of a TV show or something like that. It doesn't feel like one continuous movie. And I think maybe the easiest way to fix this, if you wanted to keep sort of the cut to black after the sort of introductory scene for the title card, that wouldn't have been okay. But I don't understand. Maybe they tested it and it didn't work or whatever. But I feel like if Jenkins just used dissolves between the acts, it would give a much bigger sense of continuity. To the individual segment, so it wouldn't feel as fractured. Again, I understand that that sort of fractured narrative is reflective of the main characters, how his identity is sort of fractured and stunted and not fully formed at this way, and that's fine, and it works thematically. But it's trading sort of a thematical point for emotional power, and I don't fully like films that sort of do that. Just because of my own aesthetic taste is not really in that direction, where I'd rather have weaker thematical import but more emotional power, because like movies and like and films, they are much more visceral and then like a novel or other pieces of writing. Anyway, so there's that. The other thing is that because ultimately my problem is this film ends up being a little bit emotionally inert or emotionally distant, is the direction, I think intentionally, is technically sloppy in a lot of places. So there's several shots which begin out of like it's supposed to, because again it's supposed to be like his because the Chiron's identity is not fully formed. There's places where it's out of focus and or sort of the camera has a tendency to not be still, but it also has random movement. And then the other thing, the thing that really does bother me, sort of for technical direction, is at night you get a lot of lens flare. Because in the way in which they shot this movie, which again, sort of blurring, and I guess it sort of works artistically, but it comes across not sort of, either it feels a little bit forced thematically, or it feels like the movie is rushed, like they were trying to get things done very, very quickly at night. Either or. In any case, I find the direction a little bit sloppy technically on those two fronts, even though it's probably intentional. And so if it's intentional, it's probably a thematic point, which I think is forced. Or if it's not intentional, it's just some sort of on-set craziness because it's very low budget scene. Now, the other sort of problem with the sort of jumps in time, give me a moment, the cat's being a pain, is there's something of a lack of continuity, or story beats are missing for some of the stories. So, like, again, maybe sort of thematically this works because it is sort of slice of life, and it is about sort of these three main episodes in Chiron's life. So some of this stuff doesn't fully matter in a way, and it works. Again, I think maybe it works better on page, but in the movie, the things I'm going to say they don't feel fractured the way in which, like, thematically they should feel fractured. They feel missing. Like, you want to see these scenes, but they're just not there. So probably the two big ones is Blue. I guess he ends up going to jail. I'm not really sure. The implication is sort of there because he's a drug dealer, but he drops out of the story in the first after the first act, and even though his partner or wife or girlfriend, whatever term you want to use, Teresa's in it, he just sort of drops out. And even though, because Ali is so good, he feels present throughout the entire film, you kind of want a line or something, or even a scene about what happened to him, and it doesn't fully, for that one, it doesn't fully matter. It's just sort of a petty annoyance on my end. But the one that really does matter is there's a subplot, or part of the way in which Chiron's identity is being fractured is his mother is a drug addict, and you kind of get the sense that she senses he's gay, and it's upsetting her, and she doesn't want to deal with it, and that's fine and everything. But in the first and second act, you see in the first act she's clearly losing drugs, but she's also clearly, it seems like a healthcare worker. She seems to have a white collar or a pink collar job. She's shown in scrubs at one point, and then in the second act she's further down the line, where she's being much more of a drug addict, and because at one point she's demanding money from her kids. She doesn't feel like she's no longer employed. So you kind of so there's a implication there that there's a story about her losing her job and whatever, which is fine. Like, that one is missing. And in case, because it's so much about Chiron, you don't really need to tell that one. But then there's another one where in the third act she's in rehab. And her being in rehab is important because it's why Chiron goes back to Miami to see her and Kevin. You need both of them to sort of motivate the character. But the thing is, there's this huge scene missing of her sort of bottoming out and going into rehab. And again, you can argue that maybe this is sort of a thematical thing about her being a drug addict and her recovering and being in rehab. It's fractured in this way because identity isn't, like, it's dealing with how our identities aren't stable across time and how people cannot be comfortable in their own skins. But the thing is, there's sort of one of the emotional cathartic moments of the film is Chiron and his mother sort of patching it up, and it ends up making the development feel forced and perfunctory, in that because you are missing the connective tissue between the acts. And that sort of thing sort of plagues it. So that sort of missing material between the acts, I think, is another reason why it sort of robs the film of emotional power. So at the end, it feels much more like an intellectual critique of toxic masculinity, or the way in which queer men of color are treated by society at large, but specifically around how appearing hard or tough in black communities or communities of color, which is fine. It sort of works on that level perfectly fine. It feels authentic to me. I can't really say because I've not experienced that firsthand. But the way in which it's the direction, the aspects of the direction and sort of the acting, it's supposed to be sort of this, doesn't, like, the movie doesn't seem like it's interested in being an intellectual film in that way. It seems to be much more about being an emotionally driven drama, but at the end it works better as an intellectual critique, and so the emotion seems to be robbed to me. And so this is what I mean by when I review La La Land, why I think it's a better film is because I would literally change nothing about La La Land, whereas for Moonlight, I wouldn't necessarily change anything on the page, but the way in which the two narrative time jumps are handled directorially and editorially, there had to be a way of shooting it or editing it together so it feels much more as a continuous story, and I think that would greatly help with the emotionality of the film. So again, I think it's a very good film. It just wasn't the best film of the year. That was Hell and High Water, but at least